of data. So the big numbers, I think a lot of companies have come to invest in Africa because they hear about GDP, they hear about population movement, they hear about the emerging middle class. But I think what we're finding now is the need to be much more specific and to go much deeper rather than much wider, and to have data that's actionable. So it's not about getting more data, it's about how we use the data. And I think for us, what we're really finding is that it's about the return. Right? So it's not that companies are spending less on data, it's that they're expecting more from the data that they're buying.
And this is, so really it's strategy.
Yeah.
It's ensuring that you're strategic in collection of data and in the outcomes.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Looking at East Africa now, and you've released some fascinating reports over the past couple of months, and you know, both in Nairobi, Kenya, and in Kampala, Uganda.
Yes.
I believe you will be doing that in South Africa
yes.
very soon. What are some of the highlights of the data that has come out?
Yeah, so I think no surprise, we're starting to see a bit of a turnaround. Actually most of 2017, we saw a bit of a decline. Both in terms of confidence and in terms of spend. So those are kind of the two main things that we measure.
This is in consumer spending?
In consumer spending, right. So consumer sentiment.
Okay.
So what we found is that consumer confidence is improving finally. It had really started to decline throughout 2017 with the ongoing situation in Kenya and with the drought and whatnot. And what we found is that consumers are becoming more confident. And we've done some analysis looking at the data and doing some forecasting around spend, consumer spend, and what we do expect to see is a turnaround in starting in Q2 this year, and really looking to see growth in the basket and the spend of consumers of mid-single digits, which is great because at the end of last year we were starting to see declines where people were actually spending less and getting less as well.
Just looking at the opportunities.
Yeah.
What are the greatest opportunities the market presents right now?
I think the biggest opportunity that the market presents is the ability to find growth and to grow the pie. I think in a lot of other markets what you'll find is that a lot of manufacturers are looking to see how they can gain share. I think if that's your view in Kenya, I think you're probably a little bit short-sighted. Mm-hmm. I think talking to a lot of our clients, talking to a lot of the retailers that we work with, the real opportunity is growing the pie. So I think those that are looking to gain share versus those that are looking to grow the pie, those that are looking to grow the pie are ultimately going to see much more growth. And I think because in order to grow the pie, you have to invest, and you have to invest in the right things. You have to invest in long-term strategic plans. It's not about investing in a promotion or investing in increasing your distribution or investing in, it's about investing in education. It's about investing in infrastructure.
The idea of tapping into virgin markets, but there's more work that goes into that.
Yeah.
However, the rewards you are saying will be there.
I think definitely.
What are the challenges that we need to overcome, and how can we start to address those?
I mean, I think one of our biggest challenges is just the diversity on the continent. If you think about the number of markets, you think about the number of ethnicities, think about just the sheer number of languages and trying to capture that and capture that diversity. And I think, again, one of the things we're finding is there is no one size fits all for Africa. Right. When people ask us, okay, what is the next big market that all your clients are investing into? There isn't one. Everyone has something different. It depends on what your needs are and what your goals are.
Africa is fascinating because often we speak about Africa as one big entity, and yet it's so diverse.
Yeah.
What have you learned in your work on the African continent?
I think the important thing with Africa is not if, it's when, right? It will be, for us it's very important because we measure consumers. Think about the number of consumers that haven't even made a brand choice. Think about the number of consumers that are just starting to get disposable income. And that's why it's interesting for us. It's also why it's interesting for a lot of our clients. Then if you look at the big macroeconomic factor, you look at GDP, you look at population growth, you look at the emerging middle class, you look at Africa and say, wow, this is the next big thing. And then what people tend to do, or what they've tended to do in the past, is they then compare it to India and China, right? In terms of the size of the middle class and in terms of the population and whatnot. What they forget is India is one government, China is one government, Africa is 54 governments, right? And that level of complexity, I think people have invested into this market not realizing that it's actually operating in the market is actually quite difficult. And you cannot, I think one of the things that we've really learned in Africa is lift and shift doesn't work. You can't take a product that you've created for another market and just bring it into Africa and expect it to be successful. I think local partnerships are very important. Right. I think local knowledge is very important, but I think timing is important. One of the ways that I heard someone describe it is they said, you want to be ahead of the curve, but you don't want to be so far ahead of the curve that you fall down.
That you miss it.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Because you want to be ahead of the curve, you want to be investing into the country, you want to be smart about where you're investing. But if you just come in and do a blanket approach for the whole continent, you're going to fail, I think.
Right, so there's the whole discussion right now on the African continent about the Continental Free Trade Area, and of course this was launched in Kigali, I think it was a couple of months ago. A lot of hope, a lot of enthusiasm, but there's a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah.
When you hear CFTA, what are you thinking?
Exactly what you're saying. A lot of hope, a lot of optimism, but difficult, right? And I think people just have to realize that these markets there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of growth to be had, but it doesn't show up and you get it. You got to be ready to put in the work, you got to be ready to invest, you got to be ready to partner, and you got to be, I know it sounds a bit cliche, but you got to be ready to get your hands dirty, roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty.
For the leaders watching right now, and especially policymakers, what would you want to say in terms of opening up this African market?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's just, we need to be thinking bigger, right? We need to be thinking and the term I like is a rising tide lifts all ships, right? And I find sometimes with clients as well as with governments and whatnot, there's a bit too much, same thing I said before, trying to get my share of the pie rather than trying to grow my pie, grow the entire pie. Right. And the inspirational leaders that I've spoken to in the different companies and the different groups throughout Kenya, that's the view, right? The view is, it's a long-term view, and it's how do we raise the tide? Mm-hmm. How do we raise the tide and lift all ships? Not how do I get my piece and go squirrel it away somewhere. Hi, I'm Bryan Sun, and you're watching the African Leadership Dialogues.
There's a lot of concern in some spaces that it's a real struggle for local businesses to grow, to scale up. And perhaps, true or false, may be easier for international corporates to come in and take the spaces. What are your thoughts on how we can empower local businesses to do better in the African environment?
So I think it's interesting. I think the way the world is changing with the democratization of data and with the lowering the barriers to entry, you can start a company, design a product, and have it delivered in weeks. Right. I think local players have more opportunity than ever before. If you look at you look at the long tail, you can, whether you're talking about media, whether you're talking about products, whether you're talking about anything, Dollar Shave Club, all these smaller companies that have come up so quickly, the barriers to entry that the big corporate multinationals have benefited from for so long are gone, right? Or they've lowered. So I think now is a time where local players definitely have a huge opportunity. I think what's missing in this market is, again, I go back to education, but also when I talk to the big multinationals, it's how do we educate the market on understanding consumers, on making the right decisions, on understanding markets and channels. And I'll give a good example is the retail market. You see all these big retailers coming into the market, and we've spoken to some of the local retailers, and their view is, you know what, this is good. It will improve the market. Right? One of the things which I find interesting, we do this study called the Africa Prospects Index, and we ask our businesses and our clients, what are your top 3 focus areas? Mm-hmm. And it used to always be supply chain, retail execution, and route to market. Right. Just distribution, execution. And what we found recently is supply chains dropped off the top 3, and measurement and insights has jumped up into the top 3, which is great for us. We love to hear that.
That's your business.
Yeah,
that's what you do.
That's our business. I promise you, we didn't influence it at all. But we're seeing it with our clients too. They want better understanding because, so the other 2 that have popped up have been innovation and consumer understanding. Because it's not enough, you can't brute force your way through anymore. You have to you have to understand the intricacies of your consumer. You have to understand the intricacies of your market. And again, there's no easy dollars anymore, and you really need to be able to get return for the investment that you make. And so in order to do that, you need to be more sophisticated around the data that you're using.
Right.
I think the gut feel won't get you where you need to get anymore. I think you definitely need to be more precise with the information that you have, and there's so much information out there.
Quality information is key.
Yes.
I'll come in a little while to how smaller businesses can access quality information, but let's talk for a little bit about the role of e-commerce.
Okay.
And how, or is it driving change in consumer patterns?
It's early days in e-commerce, and I know it's not e-commerce, but the thing I hear about much more than e-commerce is online betting. I don't know much about it, but it seems like I cannot go to an event or to a meeting without hearing about online betting. I think that's I don't have the answers, but that's a very interesting area that I think is worth diving into. In terms of e-commerce, I think it's fairly early days. I think you're seeing a bit more of it in South Africa, which is a little bit more developed. But even there, I think we're a long way off from fresh food being bought by e-commerce. I think we struggle in a market where you don't have a lot of the infrastructure, you don't have addresses, for example, and where you have security concerns. But I think what we're starting to see a lot more of is non-perishables being delivered to the office, right? So you can order something online and get it delivered to the office. But I think it's still fairly early days. We'll see. We've seen some companies emerging. We've seen some companies emerging in West Africa as well. We're working with them. We're trying to understand where the market's going to go and establish relationships with them. But I think for now, brick and mortar is still very much where the growth is going to come from. Just
staying with e-commerce, just recently, UNCTAD Secretary General Mukisa Kitui, who's actually Kenyan, he's been driving the agenda, brought Jack Ma to Kenya actually last year and to Rwanda, and looking at really how to tap into e-commerce. He said it's about building a trust economy. Is that, do you think, a big part of what we need to factor in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you think about Alibaba in China, it's very easy. People trust it. People think about M-Pesa. People trust it, and it's worked. And I think part of the reason M-Pesa worked was there was already this. People were used to that type of transaction. I don't think people are used to the e-commerce transaction, but if you think about the huge, the fact that people have skipped desktops, moved straight to mobile phones, now so many more people have access to it. But it's if I order it, is it going to get here, and is it going to be what I ordered? And it's always about, I mean, ultimately for brands, it's always about that trust and that relationship, right? Is what I'm paying for actually what I'm receiving? Right. So we'll see. I think it's going to be slow, though. I think it'll take some time.
Let me come now to the earlier question I made reference to, which is, we have an informal economy that, really holds up a lot of, a lot of the economy of this country. We've said in some ways informal is the new formal.
Right.
But we're also seeing companies starting to scale up. We're seeing companies get a little bit more muscle, growing. If you were to answer the question that our small and medium-sized companies typically would have, which would be, we don't have funds for research. How do we get in on this? We want top quality information too. So is there a way that we can access this? What would you say?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've started to do in East Africa is to, as Nielsen, we generally try. We have our global standards and our global products, and we have our what we call watch builder standards. And so the product you buy in Kenya is the same as the product you buy in the U.S. or the same as the product you buy in Europe. The problem is it's very expensive. And so what we've been trying to do is find other entry points into the market to allow access to the small, medium enterprises. And so for us, one of our challenges is people think Nielsen, they think expensive. And they think high quality goods, but expensive. And what we're trying to do is, okay, yes, if you want the Rolls Royce, you got to pay for the Rolls Royce. But if you want something maybe a little bit less, without all
but
the bells.
Still functional?
Still functional and all the bells and whistles that you want a starter pack, we have that. Okay. For us, it's about getting the word out there that we have that. One of the things we find is some of the smaller companies often they'll say, yeah, we'd love it, but we can't afford it, and the conversation stops there. And for us, it's about maybe reopening that conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
And building the awareness.
Yes.
And now we know it exists. So we've come literally to the end of the interview. And I'd like you to look into the camera and just inspire Africa. You've lived in Kenya for a few years now. You've experienced different parts of Africa. You know the data coming out of different countries on the continent. And people are always hungry for knowledge and for inspiration. If you have an opportunity to speak to young people, businesses, what would you say to them in terms of growing in the African space, please?
That's a big question. I think, I go back to it again, but I think it really is about investing for the future. And the future's bright in Kenya. And for me, again, it's the people that are investing to make that pie bigger that are going to win in the long term and that are going to win sustainably. So, you know, the focus really needs to be about making the pie bigger. As I said, a rising tide lifts all ships. So I think there's a lot more room for collaboration, a lot more room to be open, a lot more room to work together, because if we do that, ultimately everyone's going to win. But if we're trying to be closed and we're trying to protect what we have and we're trying not to change and we're trying to maintain the status quo, it's just a matter of time before those that are open and those that are investing long term and those that are more strategic are going to come, and they're going to be winning out in the long term. Wow. A rising tide raises all ships. Raises all ships. Yeah. Invest in the future, look at the long term. It's those who invest in the future who ultimately will win. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.